Matteo was 67 when the first unsettling sign appeared. He had been in the middle of fixing a loose hinge on his garden gate, the sort of small task he usually enjoyed, when a strange chill ran down his back. At first, he thought it was just the breeze, but then came the sweat. Cold, sticky, unlike anything he had felt before. He paused, pressing his hand against his forehead, confused by the clamminess that had no reason to be there. Within moments, it passed, leaving him unsettled but unwilling to dwell on it. He told himself it was nothing, just fatigue, maybe the heat. Yet somewhere inside, a quiet worry took root, though he pushed it away. That night, sitting with his wife Clara at the dinner table, Matteo noticed his fork felt heavier than usual. He laughed it off when Clara teased him about slowing down, but inside he couldn't ignore the strange weakness that had crept into his arm. The food on his plate seemed less appetizing, and after only a few bites he felt uncomfortably full, as though his stomach was rebelling. These were small things, easy to excuse, easy to tuck away behind the shield of, "I'm just getting older." But Clara watched him with her knowing eyes, the kind that had seen him through 40 years of marriage, and she asked gently if everything was all right. Matteo forced a smile, not wanting to worry her, though deep down the unease lingered. Over the next week, the moments grew more frequent. He would climb the stairs and find himself short of breath, the kind of breathlessness that made him stop halfway, holding the railing, waiting for the tightness in his chest to ease. It was subtle, nothing dramatic, but it was not the body he knew. Matteo had always been active. He had spent decades working as a craftsman, building cabinets with his own hands, lifting heavy boards, sanding until the wood was smooth as glass. To feel winded after a flight of stairs was foreign, almost insulting, and yet he told no one, not Clara, not his children, not even his old friend Antonio at the cafe. To admit it would be to give it power, and Matteo was not ready to face what it might mean. Then came the moment that broke his denial. It was a Sunday morning, bright and cool, the kind of morning Matteo cherished. He had promised his grandson Luca they would walk to the park. Something simple yet precious. But halfway there, a sudden pressure seized his jaw, sharp and strange, radiating up toward his ear. Matteo stopped in his tracks, hand pressed to his face, as Luca tugged at his sleeve, asking what was wrong. The pain lasted only minutes, but in those minutes, Matteo felt the shadow of something much larger than himself. When it eased, he forced a smile for his grandson, but his heart beat heavy with fear. Later, sitting alone in his chair, Matteo thought of his father, who had died suddenly at 58. The memory brought a chill that settled deep in his bones. For days afterward, he lived with the echo of that fear. Every twinge, every flutter of his chest, every sudden wave of fatigue became a question he could not answer. He began to notice things he had never paid attention to before. The way his left hand sometimes tingled after he carried groceries, the way dizziness brushed over him when he stood too quickly. Each sign was subtle, easy to dismiss, but together they painted a picture Matteo didn't want to see. Still, he told no one. He was proud, perhaps stubborn, and he didn't want to be the man who worried his family with vague complaints. It was Clara who finally forced his hand. One evening, she found him sitting quietly in the kitchen, pale and distant, staring at the floor. She placed a hand on his shoulder and felt the damp chill of sweat beneath his shirt. Her voice broke with fear as she urged him to see a doctor, her words carrying the weight of love and worry. For a moment, Matteo resisted, but then he saw the tears in her eyes. In that instant, he realized it wasn't only his life at stake, it was hers too, and the lives of those who loved him. The next morning, reluctantly, he agreed to visit the cardiologist. The waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic, a smell Matteo had always disliked. He sat there with his hands folded, pretending calm while his mind raced. When the doctor finally entered, a man in his 50s with kind eyes, Matteo braced himself. The examination was thorough, the questions pointed. When the results came, the words hit harder than he expected. "You're showing several warning signs of a potential heart attack." The doctor explained how arteries could narrow silently, how symptoms often whispered before they screamed. Matteo sat still, his throat dry, as memories of his father's sudden passing swirled back. This time, though, he was being given a chance his father never had, the chance to act before it was too late. That night, lying awake beside Clara, Matteo thought about his life. He thought about the mornings spent sipping coffee on the balcony, the laughter of his grandchildren, the smell of sawdust in his workshop. He thought about all the small moments he had taken for granted, the ones that made up the fabric of his days. and he thought about how quickly it could all unravel if he ignored the warnings. For the first time, he didn't push the fear away. He let it settle, heavy and real, because he knew it was the only way to face it. From that day forward, Matteo's journey began. It was not a sudden transformation, not a miracle cure, but a steady awakening. He started by listening, really listening, to his body, to the signals he had brushed aside for too long. Each step was small but significant, choosing lighter meals, resting when he felt fatigue, walking at a pace that allowed him to breathe without strain. More than that, he allowed himself to lean on Clara, to share his fears and let her support him. For a man who had carried so much alone, this was its own kind of healing. As weeks passed, Matteo noticed subtle changes. The shortness of breath didn't vanish, but he recognized it sooner and knew when to pause. The dizziness still came, but he no longer dismissed it as trivial. He kept a journal, jotting down how he felt each day, a quiet dialogue with his own body. And slowly, through these small acts of awareness, he felt a shift, not just in his health, but in his heart. He was no longer the man pretending nothing was wrong. He was a man choosing to face what scared him, choosing life over denial. In telling you about Matteo, I want you to see more than just symptoms or medical terms. I want you to see a man like so many of us, proud, hardworking, reluctant to admit weakness. I want you to feel the weight of his fear, the love that pushed him to act, the courage it takes to change. Because Matteo's story isn't just his own. It could be yours or mine or someone we hold dear. And if there is one truth it teaches us, it is this: the body speaks before it breaks, if only we are willing to listen. Matteo had always thought of himself as steady, dependable, the kind of man who quietly carried the weight of his family's world. For decades, he rose before dawn, made his own coffee, and worked with his hands until the sun went down. Life had a rhythm, one built on small rituals that felt eternal. But in recent months, something had started to unsettle that rhythm. It wasn't loud or dramatic at first, more like a whisper weaving itself into his days, a fatigue that lingered too long, a tightness he couldn't quite explain. He didn't pay much attention until the news arrived of his neighbor Roberto, a man only a few years younger who had collapsed suddenly in his kitchen. "Heart attack," the whispers went, drifting through the narrow street like smoke. Matteo stood at the gate that evening, staring at Roberto's shuttered windows, the sound of crying muffled from inside. Every 40 seconds he had read once, someone in the world lost their life this way. But statistics were numbers, and numbers never pierced his chest the way Roberto's absence did. That night, Matteo lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking of how fragile even strong men could be. The thought carried into the morning. As he buttoned his shirt, his fingers felt clumsy, slower than usual. Clara noticed. She leaned against the doorframe with a softness that only she could carry, her brow furrowed slightly. "You look pale," she said, her voice low, careful not to make it sound like an accusation. Matteo brushed it off with a chuckle, a line about age catching up, but deep inside, Roberto's face lingered. He couldn't shake it, the sense that the 40 seconds ticking away on every clock might be counting down on him too. Later that week, he walked to the cafe where his friends gathered, the same place they had met for 30 years. The air smelled of espresso and fresh bread, the clinking of cups familiar and comforting. But as Antonio joked about football, Matteo found himself distracted, his gaze falling on the steam rising from his cup. He noticed how his hand trembled faintly as he lifted it. He set it down quickly, hiding the tremor by folding his hands together. "You're quiet today," Antonio remarked, but Matteo just shrugged. How could he explain that behind his silence was a steady drumbeat of unease? It wasn't just Roberto, though that loss had opened something inside him. It was the realization that he too was no longer invincible. His father had been only 58 when the end came suddenly. Matteo remembered it vividly, the phone call, the funeral, his mother's shattered expression. He had sworn never to let himself fall the same way, yet here he was, staring at the same shadow. At night, when Clara had fallen asleep beside him, Matteo would close his eyes and try to feel his heartbeat. Was it too fast? Too slow? Was that heaviness in his chest real, or only his mind playing tricks? The doctor's words still echoed, though it had been only a few days since the appointment. "Warning signs, Matteo. Your body is giving you messages." The kind eyes of the physician had offered no comfort, only truth. "We lose people not because the signs weren't there, but because they were ignored." Matteo had nodded, but leaving the clinic, he carried the words like stones in his pocket. He wasn't ready to admit them aloud, not even to Clara. To say it out loud would make it real. One evening, he sat with his grandson Luca in the living room. The boy had sprawled across the carpet. Cars and trucks scattered around him, his laughter ringing like bells. Matteo watched him, his chest heavy with a mix of love and dread. Every 40 seconds, he thought of all the men like him who went to bed never to rise again, who left behind children, grandchildren, half-finished dreams. He thought of how Luca's eyes lit up when he said, "Nono, tomorrow let's build something in your workshop." And Matteo realized tomorrow was not something he could keep taking for granted. Clara entered quietly, carrying a small plate of sliced apples. She set them down in front of him, her hand lingering on his shoulder. "Eat," she said gently. Matteo took a slice, the sweetness sharp against his tongue, and wondered if something as simple as fruit could keep him anchored to this life he loved. He remembered the doctor mentioning small habits, subtle changes, less salt, more fresh food, movement every day. It sounded simple, almost trivial. Yet in that moment, chewing slowly, Matteo felt the truth of it. Perhaps the battle wasn't fought in grand gestures, but in choosing to care for his body in the small ways, the daily ways. That night, as he closed the shutters and looked out at the darkened street where Roberto's house still sat in silence, Matteo whispered a quiet promise to himself. He would not ignore the whispers of his body any longer. He would not wait for 40 seconds to become the measure of his life. Tomorrow, he decided, he would rise with a different kind of purpose. Not the stubborn pride of a man who pretends he's fine, but the steady courage of one who chooses to fight for time. For Clara, for Luca, for himself. And in that quiet vow, something shifted. Fear was still there, but alongside it grew a seed of determination. The kind that takes root not in panic, but in love. The morning after Matteo made his quiet vow, the house felt different, though nothing had changed. Sunlight pressed through the curtains like warm hands, the kettle sang, and Clara hummed while watering her basil on the windowsill. Yet Matteo moved as if the floorboards were thinner than before, as if a misstep could send him falling through. At the clinic, a poster had called heart disease a silent killer, and the words had followed him home like a shadow he could not shake. Silence, he realized, is not the absence of danger. It is the way danger sometimes enters a room without knocking. He went to the workshop and lifted a plank the way he had 1,000 times, palms steady, elbows close. Halfway to the sawhorse, he felt it, a hush inside his chest, then a flutter like a bird trapped behind a window. It didn't hurt, not exactly, but it wasn't right. He set the plank down and waited, breathing as if the air might split if he took too much. When the flutter faded, Matteo pulled a pencil from behind his ear and wrote a note on the corner of a sandpaper box. 10 in the morning. Felt strange, stopped, and it passed. Clara watched him come back inside earlier than usual, the earthy smell of sawdust clinging to his shirt. She asked him, with that soft bravery she always carried, if he wanted to take a walk down to the square. Matteo hesitated. Pride is a stubborn thing, especially in a man who built his life with his hands. But he remembered Luca's small palm in his, and Roberto's windows still shuttered across the street, and he said yes. They put on light jackets and walked at a pace that felt like kindness rather than retreat. The town was waking up around them, shopkeepers flipping signs from closed to open, a woman balancing a basket of pears against her hip. The street sloped gently uphill, and Matteo felt his breath grow shorter before the crest. He didn't push through it the way he might have a month ago. Instead, he slowed to the rhythm of his own footsteps. 3 steps breathing in, 3 steps breathing out, as if teaching his heart a lullaby he had forgotten. By the time they reached the fountain, the tightness had loosened, and he touched the cool stone rim with a gratitude he did not say aloud. Small changes began to appear in places that didn't look like medicine. He poured half a cup of coffee instead of a full one, then took it to the balcony so he could sip where the morning air could find him. Clara salted the soup a little less, and when he noticed, he did not complain. He tasted the sweetness of the onions instead and told her it was good. He put olive oil on his bread and remembered summers long ago when everything tasted of sun and fields. None of it felt like a rule or a punishment. It felt like turning down a loud radio so he could hear his own pulse more clearly. The doctor called in the afternoon to check how he was holding up. The voice on the line was calm, the kind that steadies you before you realize you were swaying. "Pay attention to changes," the doctor said, "and don't be afraid to come in if something feels new." Matteo leaned against the kitchen counter and let the words settle. He didn't need big explanations or long lists. He needed permission to trust what his body was telling him, to treat the quiet as information rather than emptiness. That night, he woke to find the sheets cool against his back and a bead of sweat at his temple. The room was still, the clock a soft breath on the wall, but his skin carried that clammy edge that didn't match the air. He didn't leap up or spin himself into panic. He placed a hand on his chest and counted the breaths that came, slow and careful, as if coaxing a shy animal from beneath the porch. When the chill receded, he reached for the notebook on his nightstand and wrote, "Past midnight, cold sweat, faded when I breathed and stayed still." He could have kept that to himself. He could have closed the notebook and worn courage like a mask until morning. Instead, he touched Clara's shoulder and whispered her name, and when her eyes opened, he told her the truth in plain words. The fear didn't double when he shared it. It split in two and softened as if the weight had found another set of hands. They lay awake for a while, not speaking, just listening to each other breathe. In the spaces between those breaths, Matteo understood that secrecy had been its own kind of danger all along. The next day in the workshop, he changed the way he lifted the heavy boards he used to throw around without thinking. He slid them edgewise, asked the neighbor's teenage son to help stack the top shelf, and let himself feel grateful instead of diminished. Acceptance, he found, was quieter than stubbornness, and stronger too. When Luca arrived after school, Matteo showed him how to sand with the grain, both of them leaning into the simple pleasure of turning something rough into something smooth. Joy, he reminded himself, is not a luxury, it is a reason. By evening, the kitchen smelled of tomatoes and garlic. Clara tore basil leaves into a bowl, while Matteo sliced a ripe peach for the salad, a habit he had picked up from his mother. He drizzled olive oil and watched it gloss the fruit and greens, sunlight trapped in liquid form. They ate slowly and talked about little things, the neighbor's cat, a new clerk at the market who wrapped bread like presents. The meal felt like a promise they were making together, to keep things simple, to choose what nourished more than it numbed, to turn toward each other when the quiet felt too loud. There were moments when the old fear returned, unannounced, with the entitlement of an unwelcome relative. A funeral procession passed the square one afternoon, and Matteo stood with his hat in his hands as the hearse rolled by. He felt the air thicken with the memory of his father and wondered how close he had come to repeating an ending he never wanted. But grief didn't pull him under the way it once had. It drifted through and out again like a tide, leaving clarity in its wake. Silence, he realized, loses some of its power when you meet it in daylight. He set a soft alarm on his phone for noon each day, not to take a pill or follow a rule, but to step outside, even if only to the courtyard. He would stand beneath the fig tree and breathe until the tightness softened, the way you might talk gently to a frightened horse. Sometimes he walked a small circle, sometimes he just stood still and let the sun warm the back of his neck. He wrote down what he felt, not hunting for patterns like a detective, but letting them appear if they wished. The notes began to form a map that made sense only to him, and that was enough. On a quiet afternoon, Clara found him sitting on the front steps, eyes closed, face turned toward the light. She sat beside him without a word, their shoulders barely touching. After a while, she asked if the silence still scared him. Matteo opened his eyes and looked down the street where Roberto's shutters were open again, cousins airing out the rooms. "Yes," he said, honesty sliding into the space like a fitting piece of wood, "but not the way it did. I'm listening now." She nodded, and the simple acceptance between them felt like a door opening inside his chest. This was the change, though it would not show in a blood test or a chart. Matteo had shifted from outrunning what he feared to walking beside it, watchful and unafraid to speak its name. He was learning the difference between noise and signal, between a body that complains and a body that confides. The silent killer had not vanished. It never does out of courtesy. But in the quiet he once dreaded, he had found a place to stand, hand in hand with the woman who knew his heartbeat better than anyone. And in that steadiness, life gathered itself again, ready for the next lesson it meant to teach. Matteo was never the kind of man to fuss over his body. For years he had worked through calloused hands and aching joints without complaint, brushing them off as the natural toll of honest labor. But there was something about the sweat that unnerved him. It wasn't the healthy sheen that came from stacking lumber under a hot sun, nor the warm perspiration that followed a walk through the vineyards in August. This was different, sticky, cold, arriving without cause like an unwelcome stranger slipping through the door. The first time it happened, he was seated at the kitchen table with a newspaper spread open before him. A chill swept across his forehead, and suddenly beads of sweat trickled down, though the room was neither hot nor humid. He pressed his napkin to his brow, unsettled. Clara noticed, her eyes narrowing with quiet concern. "Are you warm?" she asked. Matteo shook his head quickly, folding the napkin as if the gesture could fold the moment away as well. He murmured that it must be the coffee, too strong perhaps. But even as he said it, he felt the lie in his throat. Later that day, he stood in the workshop sanding the leg of a chair when the same sensation washed over him. Clammy skin, damp temples, a sudden paleness that made the mirror above the workbench reflect back a face he barely recognized. He leaned heavily against the bench, waiting for the wave to pass. It did, as quickly as it had come, leaving behind only unease. He glanced at the calendar on the wall, circled the date, and wrote in pencil, "Strange sweat again." That evening, Clara placed a bowl of minestrone in front of him and slid into her chair across the table. The lamp cast a warm glow over the kitchen, but Matteo felt cold inside his skin. He picked up his spoon but hesitated, appetite lost to the memory of that sudden clamminess. Clara reached across, her fingers brushing his wrist. "It's happening more, isn't it?" she asked. Her voice was gentle but firm, the way it always was when she wanted the truth from him. Matteo exhaled slowly, nodding. "Yes, twice today." Her eyes softened with worry, but she only squeezed his hand and said, "Then we'll watch together." The nights became the hardest. He would wake with the sheets damp beneath him, heart pounding as though he had been running in dreams he could not recall. The chill clung to him, even in Clara's warm embrace. Sometimes he rose quietly, not to disturb her, and paced the hallway, wiping his forehead with the back of his sleeve. In those solitary hours, he thought of his father again, the suddenness of his passing, the way his family had been left without answers. Matteo wondered if these sweats were his body's whisper, a warning carried in the language of skin and salt. One afternoon, he went to the cafe as usual, but the sweat returned while he sat across from Antonio. His friend laughed at a story, lifting his cup in emphasis, but Matteo barely heard him. A clammy dampness crept down his neck, and he pulled a handkerchief quickly from his pocket. He forced a smile, pretending to wipe crumbs from his chin. Inside, fear churned. What if Antonio noticed the paleness? What if the others asked? He hated the thought of explaining, of making his fears sound real by giving them voice. So he sipped his espresso, listening to the chatter, all the while counting the seconds until the sweat dried and he could breathe again. The doctor had spoken of symptoms that masqueraded as nothing, little warnings mistaken for nerves or weather. Cold sweats without reason, he had said, are not to be ignored. Matteo remembered the weight of that sentence. He carried it now like a stone in his pocket, a reminder that these spells were not ordinary. But knowing something in your mind is different from accepting it in your heart. And Matteo, stubborn as he was, still wrestled with the part of him that wanted to dismiss it as age, stress, anything but what it might truly be. Clara, however, refused dismissal. She began to keep her own quiet watch, noting the color of his cheeks when he returned from the workshop, the dampness at his temples when he came in from the garden. Once, she caught him leaning heavily against the counter, handkerchief pressed to his forehead. She didn't scold. She only placed a glass of cool water in his hand and said softly, "You don't have to carry this alone." Matteo looked at her then, really looked, and saw the love in her gaze mingled with fear. It was in that moment he realized the sweats weren't just his burden, they belonged to her too, because every time they struck her heart as well. Together they began making small changes. Clara suggested lighter dinners, less meat, more vegetables from the market. Matteo resisted at first, but when she served a plate of roasted eggplant drizzled with olive oil, he tasted it and found it not only palatable but comforting. He noticed too that the heaviness after meals was less pronounced, the sweats less insistent in the evenings. Was it coincidence? Perhaps. But he clung to the possibility that each small shift was a step away from danger. One night, after another episode had passed, Matteo sat at the edge of the bed with a notebook on his lap. He wrote carefully. Cold sweat. Short. No chest pain. Paleness faded after 10 minutes. Clara sat beside him, reading over his shoulder. "You're keeping track?" she asked. Matteo nodded. "The doctor said to pay attention. Maybe if I write it, I'll see the pattern." She kissed his temple, her lips brushing the dampness there, and whispered, "This is how we fight, by listening." Over time, Matteo learned not to panic when the sweat came, but to sit quietly, breathe deeply, and let it move through him like a passing storm. He learned, too, to share each moment with Clara rather than hiding it behind a mask of indifference. The fear didn't vanish, but it softened under the light of their honesty. And slowly, Matteo came to see the cold sweats not only as intruders, but as messengers. His body, silent for so many years, had finally found a way to speak. One evening, standing by the window as the last light slipped behind the hills, Matteo placed his hand against the glass and felt the coolness seep into his palm. He thought of how close he had come to dismissing these signs, how easily he could have brushed them aside until it was too late. Instead, he had begun to listen, to write, to change. He turned to see Clara setting the table, the warm glow of the lamp falling across her face. And in that simple moment he understood, survival was not only about avoiding death, but about choosing life over and over again in the small, attentive ways. And so, every time the chill returned, Matteo no longer pretended it was nothing. He acknowledged it, recorded it, and allowed it to guide him closer to the life he wanted to preserve. The silent sweat had become a teacher, and Matteo, at last, its willing student. The mirror in the hallway had been hanging there for decades, its wooden frame carved by Matteo's own hands when he was a younger man. He rarely paid it much attention. It was just a mirror, something Clara used before stepping out to the market or before guests arrived. But one morning, as he passed by, Matteo caught a glimpse of himself and stopped cold. His face, once bronzed by years of working outdoors, looked drained, almost ghost-like. The color had fled from his cheeks, leaving behind a pallor that startled him. For a moment, he reached up and touched his skin, half expecting it to feel different. It was still warm, still alive, but the sight unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Clara noticed, of course. She always noticed. She came from the kitchen with a towel in her hands, paused when she saw him frozen before the mirror, and asked, "Are you feeling unwell?" Matteo hesitated, then offered the simplest answer. "I just look tired." But even to his own ears, the words sounded thin, like paper trying to cover stone. Clara set the towel aside, stepped closer, and studied his face the way one studies the sky for signs of rain. "You're pale," she whispered, not accusing, just observing. Matteo shrugged, forcing a half smile, but inside he felt the chill of recognition. Later that day, he went to the workshop, hoping the rhythm of sanding wood might steady him. He worked for a while, the steady rasp of the paper against oak filling the room. But when he bent to lift a small stool he was repairing, the world tilted slightly. He straightened quickly, catching his breath, and walked to the window for air. In the reflection of the glass, the same pallor stared back at him, cheeks drained, lips faintly colorless. He thought of the doctor's words, "If you notice sudden paleness, especially alongside the sweats, don't ignore it." Matteo pressed his palms to the sill, fighting the urge to pretend it wasn't happening. That evening, sitting at dinner, Clara set a plate of roasted vegetables before him. She studied him as he lifted his fork, her gaze sharper than any physician's. "Matteo," she said softly, "this isn't just tiredness, is it?" He lowered his fork, meeting her eyes. Silence stretched between them. Finally, he sighed. "It happens sometimes. I catch myself in the mirror, and I don't look like myself. It fades, but—" His voice trailed off, the weight of fear pressing down on the table. Clara reached across, her hand warm on his. "Then we face it, together." The following morning, Matteo kept an appointment with the cardiologist. Sitting in the crisp, white room, he described the pallor, the sweats, the dizziness. The doctor nodded, listening intently. "Your heart," he explained gently, "sometimes struggles to pump efficiently. When that happens, the skin can lose color. It's your body's way of signaling distress." Matteo absorbed the words like blows to the chest. Yet the doctor's voice carried no alarm, only insistence. "These are warnings, Matteo. They give us time if we choose to listen." For the first time, Matteo allowed himself to see the pallor not as an enemy, but as a messenger demanding his attention. Clara, ever practical, adjusted their meals. She began serving him more iron-rich foods, lentils simmered with tomatoes, leafy greens drizzled with lemon, slices of apple paired with walnuts. "Your body needs strength," she told him, setting the plates before him as though offering armor. Matteo accepted, chewing slowly, tasting the earthiness of the lentils, the sharp tang of lemon. He found that eating this way made him feel lighter, less weighed down after meals. It wasn't a cure, but it was a gesture of care, a step toward rebuilding what his body seemed to be losing. One afternoon, Matteo walked with his grandson Luca through the square. The boy's laughter rang out as he skipped ahead, chasing pigeons. Matteo smiled, but as he caught up, a woman selling flowers called out, "Matteo, are you feeling well? You look pale." The words, though kindly meant, stung. He forced a smile and waved her off. But inside, shame curled tight. He didn't want to be the man others pitied, the man whose health became the subject of whispers. Yet as he watched Luca's small figure dart across the cobblestones, he reminded himself that pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. Better to be pale and present than silent and gone. That night, Matteo sat with Clara on the balcony, the evening breeze carrying the scent of jasmine. "I hate how it makes me look," he admitted quietly, "like I'm fading before my time." Clara leaned against him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "You're not fading," she said. "You're fighting, and every time you notice, every time you tell me, you're giving yourself a chance." Matteo turned to her, the lamplight soft on her face, and realized that her words carried more truth than his fears ever could. From then on, when the paleness came, Matteo no longer looked away. He paused, breathed, noted the moment in his journal, and adjusted. If he was working, he rested. If he was walking, he slowed. He learned that honoring his limits did not diminish him, it preserved him. He found solace in simple practices, sipping water with a squeeze of lemon when he felt weak, sitting by the open window to let fresh air fill his lungs, closing his eyes to let his body recalibrate. Each act, though small, felt like reclaiming a little piece of strength. In time, Matteo began to notice patterns. The pallor often came after heavy meals or when he pushed himself too quickly in the workshop. So he changed his rhythm. Lighter lunches, gentler work, pauses woven into his day. He found that the color returned faster when he respected these boundaries, as though his body rewarded his patience. It wasn't the life of boundless energy he once knew, but it was a life he could shape with awareness, and that he realized was a kind of freedom. One evening, Clara caught him standing before the mirror again, studying his reflection. "What do you see?" she asked softly. Matteo looked at himself, older, paler, but still standing. He thought of his father, whose chance to change had never come, and he thought of Luca, whose future still stretched wide. "I see a man learning to listen," Matteo replied. Clara smiled, slipping her hand into his. And for the first time, the paleness staring back from the glass didn't frighten him. It reminded him he was still alive, still given time to choose. Matteo had always known tiredness. As a craftsman, fatigue was part of his trade. The weight in his shoulders after hours planing wood, the ache in his legs after carrying planks across the yard. That kind of weariness was honest, deserved, the kind that melted away after a hearty meal or a good night's sleep. But this was something different. This fatigue was sly. It crept into his mornings before the day had even begun, pressing him down as though the mattress wanted to keep him prisoner. No amount of sleep seemed to erase it, and no simple explanation seemed to fit. The first time he truly noticed the change was on a Tuesday morning. Clara had asked him to fetch a small box from the attic. A simple task. He'd climbed those stairs countless times. Yet halfway up, his legs trembled, his chest tightened, and by the time he reached the top, he had to sit on the edge of a trunk, breath shallow, forehead damp. He sat there, staring at the dust swirling in the sunlight, wondering when stairs had become a mountain. Clara called up to ask if he had found the box, and Matteo answered quickly, hiding the strain in his voice. He carried the box down slowly, one careful step at a time, ashamed of how weak he felt. Later that week, fatigue returned during an afternoon walk. He and Clara had strolled to the park, something they often did after lunch. The air smelled of cut grass, children's laughter carried on the breeze, and Matteo wanted to enjoy it all. But after only a few steps past the fountain, his breath grew shallow, his legs heavy. He stopped near a bench, pretending to admire the roses, but really he needed the pause. Clara slipped her arm through his and asked, "Are you all right?" Matteo forced a smile. "Just taking it in," he said. Yet inside, fear whispered, "This isn't the tiredness you know." The doctor's words came back to him. When fatigue feels new, different from the weariness you've always known, it can be your heart struggling. Matteo hated that thought. To admit it meant acknowledging that his body was not the fortress he believed it to be. Still, the evidence kept piling up. He would sit at his workbench with tools in hand, and after only a short while, his muscles felt like lead. Even reading the newspaper left him drained, as if simply holding up the pages asked too much of him. One evening, Clara placed a bowl of lentil soup before him. She had begun cooking with more intention, choosing foods she hoped would build him up rather than weigh him down. "Eat slowly," she said, watching as he stirred the steaming broth. Matteo took a spoonful, the warmth filling his chest, and realized how much he had neglected the quiet role of food in his strength. He remembered days when he would eat heavy meats late at night, then rise sluggish in the morning. Clara had shifted their meals, lighter dinners, more vegetables, fruit in the afternoons. It wasn't just about nutrition, it was about kindness, about giving his body something it could carry without burden. Fatigue still came, but he began to notice how food and rest shaped its intensity. When he drank water steadily through the day, he felt less drained. When he allowed himself to nap for 20 minutes in the afternoon, the fog lifted just enough to make the evenings brighter. He learned, reluctantly, that fighting fatigue with stubbornness only deepened it, while surrendering to rest gave him back pieces of himself. One afternoon, Luca bounded into the workshop, asking if they could build a toy boat. Matteo looked at the boy's eager eyes, then at the scraps of wood stacked nearby. He longed to say yes, but even the thought of sawing and sanding left him weary. "Tomorrow," he promised gently. The disappointment in Luca's face pierced him, but so did the realization that he could not pretend anymore. That evening, he sat with Clara and confessed, "It's not the tired I know. It feels heavier. It feels wrong." Clara took his hand, her thumb brushing the back of it, and whispered, "Then we'll find a new way forward." The next day, Matteo tried something different. Instead of working long hours in the workshop, he divided the tasks into smaller portions. He sanded for 15 minutes, then rested. He cut wood in the morning light when his energy was strongest, saving quieter tasks like polishing for later. To his surprise, this rhythm left him less exhausted. It wasn't the same as before, he couldn't deny the difference, but it allowed him to continue without breaking himself. Clara noticed the change and encouraged him gently. She began walking with him each morning, shorter walks that ended before fatigue stole too much from him. They would stop at the fountain, sit on the stone bench, and share an orange Clara had tucked into her bag. The sweetness revived him, the coolness of water refreshed him, and for a while he felt almost like himself again. These small rituals became their anchors, proof that life could still hold beauty even when adjusted to new limits. One evening, Matteo sat on the balcony, watching the sky fade into shades of violet. He thought about how fatigue had reshaped his days, how it forced him to notice the moments he once rushed past. He remembered the way Clara's laughter sounded when he finally admitted he needed her help with the laundry, the way Luca's small hand fit into his when they sat together instead of building boats. Fatigue had stolen some of his strength, but it had also slowed him enough to see what mattered: the presence of those he loved, the gentleness of time shared rather than tasks completed. He picked up his notebook, flipping back through pages where he had written about sweats, pallor, now fatigue. Each entry was a reminder that his body was not failing him out of cruelty, but speaking to him in its own language. He wrote carefully, "This tiredness is not the same. It asks me to slow down, to choose differently." He closed the notebook and felt a quiet acceptance settle over him. Fatigue, he realized, was not just an enemy, it was a guide, urging him to care for himself in ways he had ignored. It reminded him that rest was not weakness, but wisdom, that food could be medicine, that rhythm mattered more than speed. As the stars appeared above, Matteo whispered a prayer of gratitude, not for the fatigue itself, but for the chance to notice, to adapt, to still be here, learning how to live within his limits. And in that moment, he felt not defeated, but alive. The first time Matteo truly noticed the breathlessness, it was early morning. The air outside was crisp, scented with dew, and the town was just beginning to stir. He had stepped outside to sweep the front steps, a chore he had done 1,000 times. But this time, halfway through, his chest tightened and the broom grew heavier in his hands. He paused, leaned against the railing, and drew in a breath that seemed too small, as though the air around him had thinned. For a moment he stood there, listening to the quiet hum of the waking street, unsettled by how even the simplest task could leave him gasping. He didn't mention it right away. Pride kept him silent, the same pride that had carried him through years of hard work and long days. But later that week, when Clara asked him to bring up the laundry basket from the courtyard, the same thing happened. The climb up the narrow stairs left him lightheaded, chest heaving as though he'd run a great distance. Clara noticed this time. She took the basket gently from his hands and set it aside, her eyes lingering on him with quiet worry. "You're out of breath," she said softly. Matteo forced a smile, muttering something about needing to exercise more. But even as he said it, he knew this wasn't the same as being unfit. This was different, deeper, heavier. The doctor's words returned to him like an echo. Shortness of breath that feels unusual, especially after small efforts, can be the heart's cry for help. Matteo hated those words. He didn't want to believe his heart, the steady companion that had carried him through 6 decades, could be faltering, and yet each day seemed to bring proof. Sweeping, climbing stairs, even bending to tie his shoes, left him feeling as though a weight had been pressed against his chest. Clara, unwilling to let denial take root, suggested they change their evening walks. Instead of the longer path through the park, they would stroll only as far as the fountain, stopping to rest on the cool stone bench. At first, Matteo resisted, insisting he could manage the longer route, but halfway there, the breathlessness returned, and this time he couldn't hide it. He sat heavily on the bench, head bowed, chest rising and falling too quickly. Clara rested a hand on his back, silent but steady, until his breathing eased. When he finally looked up, he saw her eyes glistening with tears she tried to hide. "It scares me," she admitted. And in that moment, Matteo realized it wasn't just his fear he carried, it was hers too. Determined to change something, Matteo began paying closer attention to how he moved. He no longer rushed through tasks, no longer tried to do everything at once. He paced himself, allowing pauses between chores, resting when his body asked him to. He also listened when Clara suggested lighter foods in the evenings, soups rich with vegetables, fish grilled with herbs, fruit for dessert. To his surprise, he found that these meals left him less sluggish, his chest less tight afterward. It wasn't a cure, but it was a kindness, a way of giving his heart room to breathe. One afternoon, Luca came to visit, his small backpack slung over his shoulder. "No, let's go feed the ducks," he exclaimed. Matteo hesitated, worried about the walk, but the sparkle in his grandson's eyes gave him courage. Together, they strolled to the pond at the edge of town. Matteo carried a small bag of crumbs, Luca skipping beside him. Halfway there, Matteo's breath grew shallow, and he stopped beneath the shade of a tree. Luca looked up, puzzled. "Are you tired, Nono?" Matteo nodded, crouching to meet his grandson's gaze. "A little," he admitted. "Sometimes my breath feels heavy." Luca thought for a moment, then smiled. "Then we'll go slowly. Ducks don't mind waiting." Matteo laughed, the sound easing the weight in his chest more than any breath could. Back at home, Matteo began keeping track of these moments in his notebook. Walked to pond, had to stop halfway, felt better after resting. Writing it down helped him see patterns, helped him recognize that this breathlessness wasn't random. It appeared when he pushed too hard, when he forgot to pace himself. Slowly, he began to adjust, learning to move at a rhythm that matched his heart rather than fought against it. Clara, ever resourceful, introduced him to a new ritual. Each afternoon, she brewed a pot of herbal tea, mint, chamomile, sometimes a sprig of rosemary from the garden. They would sit on the balcony together, sipping slowly, letting the warm steam fill their lungs. Matteo found that these quiet moments of breathing deeply over a cup of tea eased the tightness in his chest. It was a simple act, almost ordinary, but it reminded him that healing didn't always come from grand gestures. Sometimes it came from pausing long enough to let the body find its own calm. The hardest part, however, was the nights. Often he would wake suddenly, chest heavy, breath shallow. The darkness seemed to magnify everything, the sound of his own breathing, the racing of his thoughts, the fear of what might come. Clara would stir beside him, reach for his hand, and whisper, "Breathe with me." Together they would count, in and out, until the rhythm steadied. Matteo realized then that breath was not only a physical act, but a shared one. With Clara's hand in his, he never felt alone in those moments. As weeks passed, Matteo began to see the breathlessness not only as a warning, but as a teacher. It forced him to slow down, to notice the world around him in ways he never had before. On their shorter walks, he saw details he once rushed past: the curve of ivy on a stone wall, the laughter of children chasing a ball, the golden glow of lamplight against evening windows. Life, he realized, was not measured by how far or how fast he could walk, but by the moments he gathered along the way. One evening, as they sat by the fountain, Clara asked, "Do you miss the way it used to be, when you could walk for hours without stopping?" Matteo thought for a moment, then shook his head. "I miss the ease, yes, but now I see more, I feel more. The weight in my chest reminds me that every breath is borrowed time, and borrowed time is still a gift." Clara smiled, her eyes reflecting the soft glow of the street lamps. Together they sat in silence, listening to the gentle splash of water, grateful for the breaths they still shared. Breathlessness had frightened Matteo at first, making him feel fragile, diminished. But slowly, through patience, small changes, and the unwavering presence of those he loved, he learned to carry it differently. It was still there, a shadow that followed him, but it no longer defined him. Instead, it reminded him of the delicate balance of life, of the preciousness of each moment. And in that awareness, Matteo discovered not just survival, but a deeper way of living. It began innocently, as so many of Matteo's symptoms had. A dull ache along his jawline, nothing sharp enough to demand alarm, just enough to be irritating. At first, he thought he had chewed too hastily or clenched his teeth in his sleep. He told himself it was trivial, the kind of discomfort a man his age could expect. But as days passed, the ache returned, sometimes climbing toward his ear, sometimes tugging at his temple. It was always on the left side, always unexpected, and always gone too soon for him to truly explain. One evening, as he and Clara sat in the living room with Luca building blocks on the floor, the ache flared suddenly. Matteo pressed a hand against his jaw, grimacing. Clara noticed immediately. "What is it?" she asked, her voice sharpened by worry. Matteo shook his head. "Just my teeth, maybe." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't quite true. He had no cavities, no dental troubles, nothing that explained the sudden weight that settled in his jaw like a stone. Clara watched him closely, her lips pursed, as if she too doubted the easy excuse. That night, lying in bed, Matteo turned the ache over in his mind. It wasn't like the steady pulse of a toothache. It wasn't sharp like the sting of something caught between his molars. It was deeper, stranger, a tugging that came and went without reason. He remembered what the doctor had once mentioned. Sometimes pain doesn't show up where you expect. The heart borrows the nerves of other places. He hated the thought, but it clung to him as he tried to sleep, his hand resting against his jaw. The next morning, Clara placed a bowl of oatmeal before him, sprinkled with sliced figs from their tree. He ate slowly, chewing carefully, half expecting the ache to return. And sure enough, by the time he finished, a heaviness settled along the left side of his face. He set the spoon down, frowning. Clara reached across the table, touching his arm. "Matteo," she said softly, "this isn't your teeth. You know that." He didn't answer, but his silence was admission enough. Later that day, he went to the workshop, hoping distraction might push the thought aside. But as he bent to lift a plank, the ache flared again, sharper this time, radiating toward his ear. He set the wood down quickly, heart pounding. For a moment, he stood there, breathing hard, realizing that this was not something he could sand away, not something he could dismiss. He wrote it down in his notebook. Jaw pain, left side while lifting wood. Faded after a few minutes. The act of writing steadied him, made it feel less like a shadow and more like a fact he could face. Clara, determined to help, prepared softer meals that evening. Vegetable soup, warm bread dipped in olive oil. Less chewing, she explained with a smile, though they both knew it wasn't really about the chewing. Matteo ate quietly, savoring the broth, and admitted to himself that Clara's small acts of care were what anchored him in these uncertain days. After dinner, she brewed chamomile tea, and together they sat on the balcony, the night air cool against their skin. "We'll talk to the doctor again," she said firmly. Matteo nodded, the ache still lingering faintly, a reminder he couldn't escape. The doctor listened carefully when Matteo described the symptoms. "Pain in the jaw, especially on the left, can sometimes be a warning," he said, his tone serious but calm. "It doesn't mean it always is, but it should never be ignored." He explained how the heart's nerves sometimes confused the body, sending pain to places like the jaw or shoulder. Matteo left the clinic subdued, the doctor's words echoing in his mind. It frightened him, yes, but it also gave him clarity. This was not random. This was a signal. From that day on, Matteo treated the jaw pain differently. He no longer brushed it aside with jokes about age or teeth. When it came, he paused, breathed, wrote it down. He noticed it often arrived during moments of exertion, climbing stairs, lifting, even walking too briskly. So he adjusted. He slowed his pace, carried lighter loads, took the stairs one step at a time. It felt humbling, but also oddly liberating, as though he were finally acknowledging the truth his body had been whispering. One afternoon, Luca asked to play outside, tossing a ball into Matteo's hands. Matteo hesitated, worried the game might trigger the ache. But then he saw the boy's expectant smile and decided to try, with care. They tossed the ball gently back and forth, laughter weaving through the courtyard. When the ache stirred faintly in Matteo's jaw, he paused, sat on the bench, and called Luca to sit with him. "Sometimes Nono gets tired," he explained, "but that just means we sit and talk instead." Luca nodded, leaning against him, and in that simple moment, Matteo felt the heaviness lift, not from his jaw, but from his heart. Clara continued to shape their days with quiet wisdom. She suggested short walks after meals, not fast, just enough to keep the blood moving. She added more fresh herbs and leafy greens to their table, dishes that felt nourishing without being heavy. Matteo found that these changes, though small, eased his discomfort. The ache still came, but less often, less sharply. And when it did, he was ready, not panicked, but attentive, breathing through it until it passed. One evening, as the sun sank low, Matteo sat on the balcony watching the colors fade from the sky. He touched his jaw where the ache had stirred earlier and thought about how easily he could have dismissed it. He thought of his father, whose pain had been sudden, unexplained, fatal, and he thought of himself, still here, still given warnings in the form of aches and whispers. Clara stepped outside, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Does it hurt now?" she asked. Matteo shook his head, smiling faintly. "Not anymore, but I'm listening." And in that quiet acknowledgement, he felt a shift. The jaw pain was no longer just a threat. It was a reminder that his body was still speaking, still fighting to keep him here. By choosing to listen, to adapt, to lean on Clara's steady presence, Matteo realized he was not powerless. He was, in fact, more alive than he had been in years, not because he was free of pain, but because he had learned to honor it as a guide. Matteo had always trusted his stomach. Through years of heavy meals after long days of work, through countless plates of pasta shared with friends, through late-night glasses of wine and wedges of cheese, his stomach had been a loyal companion. So when discomfort began to settle there, he was certain it was only indigestion. After all, who at 67 didn't struggle with a bit of bloating or heartburn now and then? He told himself it was the tomatoes, or the bread, or perhaps that he was eating too quickly. But deep inside, a quieter thought lingered. What if this pain wasn't from food at all? It started subtly, a heaviness after meals, as though the food lingered longer than it should. At first, Matteo ignored it, patting his belly with a laugh and muttering, "Clara, I'm getting old." But one evening, while walking with her through the square, the pain arrived without warning. A deep ache bloomed in his stomach, radiating upward into his chest. He stopped suddenly, clutching his middle. Clara turned quickly, alarm flashing in her eyes. "Is it indigestion?" she asked. Matteo nodded, though his lips pressed into a tight line. The pain wasn't sharp, but it was unsettling, too heavy, too insistent, different from the meals of his youth when overeating left him drowsy but harmless. That night, lying in bed, the discomfort returned, even though hours had passed since dinner. He rolled onto his side, waiting for relief, but none came. The ache lingered, stubborn, until sleep finally overtook him. By morning, it was gone, as though it had never been. Still, the memory clung to him like a shadow. Indigestion, he repeated to himself, as though naming it could make it true. But the word felt too small for what he had felt. Clara noticed the changes quickly. She watched him push away food he once loved, saw the way his hand sometimes hovered near his stomach during quiet evenings. One afternoon, she served him a plate of roasted zucchini drizzled with olive oil. "Lighter food might help," she suggested. Matteo ate slowly, chewing carefully, and admitted that it felt easier, less heavy. Clara smiled faintly. "Perhaps it's not just your stomach, Matteo. Perhaps it's your heart telling you to be gentle." He wanted to argue, to insist that indigestion was all it was, but the way her eyes lingered told him she saw more than he wanted to admit. At the doctor's office, Matteo reluctantly described the pain. The physician leaned forward, hands folded, and explained how heart-related discomfort could sometimes masquerade as stomach trouble. "It doesn't always announce itself in the chest," he said gently. "Sometimes it feels like bloating, like indigestion, especially in men your age. The important thing is not to ignore it." Matteo left the clinic unsettled, the word indigestion now tangled with fear. What he had always treated as a trivial nuisance might be something far more dangerous. Back at home, Clara began experimenting with meals. She swapped rich sauces for fresh herbs, heavy meats for grilled fish, thick bread for small bowls of lentils. Matteo resisted at first. Change was never easy, but soon he noticed a difference. The heaviness after meals was less pronounced. He felt lighter, steadier, as though his body was thanking him for the kindness. One evening, he sliced an apple after dinner, savoring its crisp sweetness, and realized he didn't miss the heaviness of his old habits. Perhaps, he thought, there was wisdom in simplicity, yet the pain did not vanish entirely. One Sunday morning, as he walked to church with Clara, it returned, a low ache in his stomach that pulsed upward. He paused outside the church doors, steadying himself. Clara touched his arm, her brow furrowed. "Again?" she whispered. Matteo nodded, taking a slow breath. They stood together quietly until the ache faded. Inside the church, as the hymns rose, Matteo closed his eyes and prayed, not only for relief, but for the courage to face what the pain might mean. Slowly, Matteo began to recognize the difference between ordinary discomfort and something deeper. Indigestion, he realized, eased with rest, with water, with lighter meals. But this new pain arrived without reason, sometimes even when he hadn't eaten at all. It was unpredictable, uninvited, a reminder that his heart might be calling through his stomach, asking him to listen. He began writing these moments in his notebook too. Ache after walk, no food. Ache after dinner, faded with rest. The entries lined up like breadcrumbs leading him toward truth. Clara encouraged him with small gestures. She brought fresh mint from the garden for tea, brewed ginger in warm water when the ache returned. Matteo found these comforts soothing, not because they erased the pain, but because they reminded him he wasn't alone. Together, they treated each ache not as an enemy, but as a signal to slow down, to care, to choose wisely. One evening, as they shared dinner on the balcony, Clara asked gently, "Do you miss the old meals?" Matteo thought of the heavy stews, the late-night feasts, the second helpings of meat. He smiled faintly. "I miss them, yes, but I don't miss how they made me feel. I would rather eat simply and stay here with you than feast and risk leaving you too soon." Clara reached across the table, her hand warm in his, and in that moment, the shift was complete. Food was no longer just sustenance or pleasure. It was part of his survival, part of the life he wanted to protect. As weeks passed, the stomach pain came less often, though never fully disappeared. Each time it arrived, Matteo met it with attention rather than denial. He rested, breathed, wrote it down, and adjusted. The pain, once frightening, had become a teacher, showing him the delicate balance between heart and body, between indulgence and care. He understood now that his heart did not always shout from his chest. Sometimes it whispered from his stomach, subtle but insistent, urging him to listen. One afternoon, watching Luca chase a ball across the courtyard, Matteo felt the familiar ache stir faintly. He sat down on the steps, pressing a hand to his stomach, and waited for it to ease. Luca noticed and ran over. "Are you okay, Nonno?" Matteo smiled, pulling the boy close. "Yes, little one. Sometimes my heart talks to me through my belly, but I'm listening now." Luca laughed, not fully understanding, and nestled against his grandfather. And in that simple exchange, Matteo felt lighter, not because the pain was gone, but because he had learned to live with it, to see it as part of the story his body was telling. Matteo had always carried the strength of his back like a badge of honor. It was the part of him that bore the weight of cabinets, beams, and planks through decades of labor in his workshop. His back had lifted his children high into the air when they were small, had bent in the garden to tend tomatoes, had leaned against trees when he paused for a smoke in younger years. But lately, that strength had begun to falter. At first, it came as a dull ache between his shoulder blades, the kind he used to call a worker's ache. Yet unlike before, this ache did not fade with stretching, nor did it ease with rest. It clung to him like a shadow, quiet but insistent, reminding him that something deeper might be wrong. One afternoon, Matteo was sanding the edge of a table when the pain struck sharper than before. It started between his shoulder blades and spread outward, as if invisible hands were pressing firmly from the inside. He set down the sander and leaned against the bench, closing his eyes. For years, he had known the difference between muscle pain and something else. This was not the soreness of labor. It was heavier, stranger, as though it lived deeper than muscle. He waited, breathing slowly until it faded to a dull throb. Still, it unsettled him. He wrote it in his notebook. Back pain, between blades. Different, not muscle. Clara found him later in the kitchen, rubbing the spot beneath his left shoulder. She frowned, drying her hands on a towel. "Again?" she asked softly. Matteo nodded. "It doesn't go away this time." Clara's eyes filled with worry, but she said nothing more. Instead, she set a bowl of soup before him and watched as he ate slowly, her silence heavy with unspoken questions. That night, in bed, she whispered, "Your father had back pain before." She stopped herself, but the unfinished sentence lingered in the dark. Matteo turned toward her, pressing her hand between his own. "I know," he admitted. "That's what scares me." The following morning, he went to the doctor once more. Describing the pain, he expected dismissal, perhaps talk of posture, of muscles tightening with age. But the doctor did not dismiss him. Instead, he listened carefully, then explained how certain kinds of back pain could be linked to the heart, even to the large vessels like the aorta. Matteo left the clinic quieter than he had entered, carrying those words with him like stones in his pocket. This was not simply about sore muscles. It was a warning his body had been whispering, and now he could no longer pretend not to hear. At home, Clara adjusted again. She encouraged him to rest more often in the afternoons, bringing cushions to support his back when they sat on the balcony. She began cooking with turmeric and garlic, herbs she had read could support the body's strength. Matteo smiled at her efforts, grateful for the way she turned every fear into a small act of care. In return, he tried to listen to his body instead of fighting it. When the back pain arrived, he stopped. He breathed. He refused to push through it as he once had. This humility was not easy for him, but he began to see it not as weakness, but as wisdom. One Sunday, Luca asked him to play a game of catch in the courtyard. Matteo agreed, eager for the boys' laughter, but after only a few throws, the pain stirred again. He sat down on the stone steps, pressing a hand to his back. Luca ran over, concerned. "No, are you hurt?" Matteo shook his head gently. "Not hurt, just tired here," he said, pointing to the spot between his shoulders. Luca thought for a moment, then plopped down beside him. "Then let's just sit and watch the clouds." Matteo laughed, the sound easing the heaviness in his chest more than rest ever could. Together, they lay back on the steps, tracing shapes in the sky. Matteo realized then that even in pain, life offered sweetness if he was willing to change how he moved through it. Clara encouraged gentle stretches in the mornings, guiding him through movements she had learned years ago from a neighbor who practiced yoga. Matteo resisted at first. He was no dancer, no athlete, but soon he found the stretches brought relief. They did not erase the pain, but they softened its edges. More importantly, the routine gave him a sense of agency, a way to greet each day not with dread, but with intention. He began to pair these stretches with deep breaths, closing his eyes and imagining his back loosening, his heart easing its grip. The pain still came, sometimes sharp, sometimes dull, but Matteo no longer met it with fear alone. He wrote each episode in his notebook, noting what he had been doing, what he had eaten, how long it lasted. Patterns emerged. He noticed the pain often arrived when he was carrying too much, when he rushed, when meals were heavier. With this knowledge, he began to change. He carried smaller loads. He ate more gently. He moved at a pace that honored his body's limits. It wasn't a cure, but it was a way of living alongside the pain rather than against it. One evening, Clara found him sitting quietly by the window, staring at the fading light. "Are you afraid?" she asked. Matteo thought for a long moment. "Yes," he admitted, "but I am also grateful. The pain reminds me I'm still here, still given a chance to listen. My father never had that chance." Clara slipped her arm through his, resting her head against his shoulder. In that silence, Matteo realized that the pain, though unwelcome, had brought him closer to her, had taught him the value of honesty, of leaning on someone else's strength when his own faltered. Over time, Matteo reframed the back pain, no longer just a symptom to fear. It became a teacher, urging him to slow down, to rest, to cherish the hours given to him. When the ache stirred, he no longer cursed it. Instead, he paused, breathed, and let it guide him to gentler choices. He found comfort in the simple rituals Clara created. Cups of ginger tea in the evenings, slow walks beneath the fig tree, quiet talks at dusk. These small acts stitched meaning into the discomfort, transforming it from an enemy into an unlikely ally. One night, as he closed his notebook after another entry, Matteo whispered to himself, "The pain is not here to break me. It is here to remind me to live differently." And in that acknowledgement, he felt a shift deep inside, a steadiness that even the sharpest ache could not erase. His back might no longer carry the weight of heavy beams, but it carried something greater now, the wisdom of listening, the courage of acceptance, and the tenderness of love that had grown stronger through every trial. It was a Saturday morning when Matteo first felt it clearly. He had gone out to the garden, determined to prune the vines before the midday sun grew too strong. The clippers fit awkwardly in his hand, and as he reached to snip a wayward branch, a strange tingling began to spread down his left arm. At first it was faint, like the pins and needles that come when a limb falls asleep. He shook his hand, expecting it to fade, but instead the numbness crept further, from his shoulder down to his fingers. He stood there, clippers dangling, staring at his own hand as though it belonged to someone else. The sensation passed after a few minutes, but it left a residue of unease. Matteo returned inside, setting the clippers quietly on the table. Clara was kneading dough, her hands dusted with flour. She looked up and frowned. "You're pale again," she said softly. Matteo hesitated, then admitted, "My arm went numb, just for a moment." Her eyes darkened with concern. "Which arm?" she asked, though he already knew the answer mattered. "The left," he whispered. The kitchen grew heavy with silence. All that day, the numbness lingered in his mind even when his arm felt normal. He carried Luca on his lap in the afternoon, the boy chattering about school, and Matteo found himself testing the strength of his grip, squeezing the boy's small hand just to be sure it was still there. It was, but the fear remained. He thought of his father again, remembered how sudden it had been, how no one had seen it coming. Now he wondered if these small, fleeting warnings were the very things his father had never spoken of. At the doctor's office the following week, Matteo recounted what had happened. The physician listened carefully, nodding. "Numbness in the left arm is something we always take seriously," he explained. "Sometimes it's nerves, sometimes circulation, but when paired with your other symptoms, it can be your heart." Matteo sat quietly, absorbing the words. He wanted to protest, to suggest it was fatigue, posture, perhaps even his old woodworking injuries. But deep down he knew this was different. This was not the ordinary wear of years. Clara, always attentive, began adjusting their routines again. She encouraged him to take short rests between activities, to avoid lifting anything too heavy with his left arm. She even suggested alternating chores. On some days, she carried the heavier shopping bags herself, despite his protests. "I'd rather carry them than carry my grief," she said firmly, silencing him with the raw truth of her words. Matteo realized then that admitting his limits wasn't just about his survival, it was about hers too. Meals shifted once more. Clara introduced more leafy greens, citrus fruits, and nuts into their diet, foods rich in what the doctor had called strength for the blood. Matteo found himself developing a taste for walnuts in the morning, cracking them open slowly and savoring their earthy flavor. He paired them with slices of orange, the sharp sweetness bright on his tongue, and told himself that each bite was another small promise to stay. It wasn't just food, it was hope disguised as breakfast. The numbness came and went in the weeks that followed. Sometimes it was a faint tingle while walking to the square, sometimes a heaviness after carrying wood. Each time, Matteo stopped, noted it, and waited until it passed. No longer did he brush it off as fatigue. He had learned painfully that pretending made it worse. Instead, he wrote carefully in his notebook, "Left arm numbness, 5 minutes, during walk, faded with rest." The act of writing made it real, but it also gave him control. If his body was speaking, he would answer by listening. One afternoon, Luca begged him to play catch again. Matteo agreed, but this time with caution. They tossed the ball gently, laughter filling the courtyard. When the familiar tingling stirred in Matteo's arm, he stopped immediately, lowering himself onto the steps. Luca came running. No, is it happening again?" Matteo nodded, smiling faintly. "Yes, but it will pass." Luca frowned, his young brow furrowed with worry. Matteo placed the ball in his grandson's hands. "This is my reminder," he said softly. "My arm tells me when to rest, so now we rest together." They sat side by side, tossing pebbles across the cobblestones, finding a new game that asked less of Matteo's body but gave them just as much joy. The numbness, though frightening, began to change Matteo's perspective. It reminded him that strength was not in denying weakness but in honoring it. He began to slow his pace, to choose gentler movements, to appreciate the simple grace of being able to use his arm at all. He discovered that moments of rest held their own kind of beauty. Watching Clara's hands fold laundry, listening to Luca's chatter, feeling the evening breeze cool against his skin. These were the gifts hidden inside the warnings. One evening, Clara brought him a cup of green tea with lemon. "This helps circulation," she said, setting it before him. Matteo sipped slowly, the warmth spreading through him, and felt gratitude rise in his chest. Not just for the tea, but for her. her quiet determination, her unspoken strength. He realized then that his journey was not just about surviving his symptoms. It was about learning how to live differently, more gently, in partnership with the people who loved him. The numbness still frightened him when it came, but it no longer left him powerless. Each time he paused, breathed, noted it down, and adjusted. He no longer fought to be the man who carried everything alone. He allowed Clara to share the load, allowed Luca to accept a slower game, allowed himself to be vulnerable without shame. And in that vulnerability, he discovered a new kind of resilience, one that did not hide weakness but embraced it as part of life. One night, as he closed his notebook after another entry, Matteo whispered to himself, "This arm reminds me to live carefully. It's not just fatigue, it's my heart speaking." He looked at Clara beside him, her face soft in the lamplight, and knew that each warning, each numbness was not the end. It was an invitation to rest, to love, to remain. And for now, that was enough. It was late afternoon when Matteo first felt the dizziness strike with real force. He had been standing in the courtyard watching Clara hang laundry on the line when the ground seemed to tilt beneath his feet. For a moment, he thought the earth itself had shifted, but then he realized it was him. The sky blurred, the world swayed, and he reached instinctively for the wall beside him. Clara turned just in time to see his knees buckle. She rushed forward, steadying him by the arm. "Matteo!" she cried, her voice trembling. He closed his eyes, trying to steady the storm inside his head, and whispered, "I'm fine, just dizzy." But he wasn't fine, and they both knew it. The dizziness passed after a few minutes, leaving him weak but upright. Clara insisted he sit inside, bringing a glass of water and watching him sip slowly. "This isn't just tiredness," she said firmly, her eyes locked on his. "You don't fall against walls because of tiredness." Matteo wanted to argue, to downplay it, but the memory of nearly collapsing was too fresh. He only nodded, silently acknowledging the truth. That evening, he wrote in his notebook, "Dizzy in courtyard, almost fell. Clara caught me. Faded after a few minutes." The words looked small on the page compared to the fear he had felt. He could still remember the way the world tilted, the way the air seemed to vanish from his lungs. He thought of his father again, wondered if dizziness had come to him too before the end. The thought brought a heaviness Matteo could not shake. The doctor, when told, was serious. "Sudden dizziness, especially with your other symptoms, can signal poor blood flow to the brain," he explained gently. "It's a warning, Matteo. You must not ignore it." Matteo sat quietly, listening, the words sinking deep. Warnings. His body seemed to speak in a language he had ignored for too long, but now every word felt urgent, every signal a bell tolling. Clara began watching him more closely after that. She insisted he take her arm when walking through town, even on short errands. At first, Matteo resisted, pride prickling at the thought of needing support. But one morning, as they crossed the square, dizziness swept over him again, sudden and sharp. This time, Clara was there, steady as stone, guiding him to a bench until the wave passed. When he finally opened his eyes, he saw her face pale with fear. And he realized her hand in his was not only keeping him upright, it was keeping her anchored too. From then on, he stopped resisting. Life changed in small ways. Matteo began moving more slowly, rising carefully from chairs, pausing before each step on the stairs. Clara adjusted their meals yet again, introducing more fresh fruits, particularly bananas, saying softly, "They'll help balance things." She brewed rosemary tea in the evenings, the fragrant steam curling around them as they sat together. Matteo found the tea soothing, not just for his body, but for the way it marked each day with Clara's quiet care. The dizziness did not vanish, but Matteo learned to meet it differently. Instead of panicking, he breathed deeply, focused on steadying himself, and waited for it to pass. He kept writing in his notebook, each entry a map of his journey. Dizzy after climbing stairs, dizzy while walking, better after sitting. The notebook filled with these small testimonies, each line a reminder that his body was speaking, that he was still here to listen. One afternoon, Luca visited, bounding into the workshop with his usual energy. "Nonno, show me how to carve again." Matteo smiled, handing the boy a small piece of wood and guiding his hand carefully with the blade. As they worked, a wave of dizziness came over him, blurring his vision. He set the knife down quickly, resting his hands on the table. Luca looked up, concerned. "Are you okay?" Matteo nodded, forcing a smile. "Just dizzy for a moment." He pulled the boy close, choosing to rest instead of push through. It pained him to pause, but he knew the risk of pretending was far greater than the disappointment of stopping. Clara, watching from the doorway, brought them both glasses of cool water. She sat beside Matteo, her hand resting lightly on his back. "You're learning," she said softly. Matteo met her gaze, understanding what she meant. He was learning to listen, to stop, to choose wisely. He realized then that survival wasn't about never stumbling. It was about knowing when to pause, when to lean on others, when to accept that he was no longer invincible. The dizziness, frightening as it was, gave him new eyes for the world. Moving more slowly, he noticed things he once overlooked, the way the light shifted through the curtains in the afternoon, the smell of basil when Clara pinched its leaves, the sound of Luca's laughter echoing down the hallway. Life, he discovered, was not measured in how quickly he could move, but in the moments he gathered while standing still. One evening, as the sun set over the hills, Matteo sat on the balcony with Clara. The dizziness had struck earlier that day, but now he felt steady, calm. "It scares me," he admitted softly. "When the world tilts, I wonder if it will stop before I do." Clara squeezed his hand. "It scares me too, but every time you tell me, every time you let me help, I feel we're still in this together. That makes me less afraid." Matteo smiled faintly, her words easing the weight on his chest more than any medicine could. That night, he wrote in his notebook once more, "Dizziness is frightening, but it reminds me I am alive, still here, still learning." He closed the book, set it on the nightstand, and lay beside Clara, her breathing steady against his shoulder. The dizziness might come again tomorrow or the day after, but tonight, Matteo felt a quiet strength, born not from denial, but from honesty, from love, from the simple act of listening to his body and leaning into the care of those around him. For the first time, he no longer saw dizziness only as a threat. He saw it as a messenger, a fragile reminder of how precious each moment was. And though the ground might tilt beneath him again, Matteo knew he would not face it alone. The doctor's words lingered in Matteo's mind long after their appointment. "Your heart struggles because of blockages. They form slowly, silently, until one day the body can no longer ignore them." It was unsettling to think of something building inside him, hidden, unseen, yet powerful enough to threaten his life. Matteo had spent his years shaping wood into beauty, smoothing roughness into curves, crafting order from chaos. But inside his chest, a different craft had been at work, an accumulation of things he could not see, shaping his fate without his permission. That evening, Matteo sat with Clara at the table, picking at a plate of grilled vegetables. He pushed the food around with his fork, his mind elsewhere. Finally, he looked up at her. "The doctor said there are blockages," he admitted, the word heavy in his mouth. Clara set down her fork, her eyes soft but unwavering. "Then we learn why they are there," she replied gently, "and we learn what to do with the days we have." Matteo nodded, grateful for her steadiness. She had a way of turning even fear into something that could be faced. He thought back to his younger years, the years of long hours and quick meals. How many times had he grabbed fried food on the way home from the workshop, too tired to cook? How many evenings had he ended with cigarettes, the smoke curling in the dark as though it carried away his worries? He had stopped smoking years ago, but the memory of those choices haunted him now. It was strange, he thought, how the body remembered every decision, storing them away until the cost came due. The doctor had explained it simply: fatty deposits, cholesterol, inflammation. Words Matteo didn't fully grasp, but understood enough to know they meant trouble. It wasn't just one meal, one cigarette, one restless night. It was years woven together into something his arteries could no longer ignore. Matteo scribbled in his notebook that night, "Blockages are built, not born. They come from choices, but choices can change." He underlined those last words twice, holding on to them like a lifeline. Clara took the lead in changing their meals again. She drizzled olive oil over salads, added handfuls of walnuts and seeds to their bread, filled bowls with beans and lentils. Matteo, once reluctant, found himself surprised by how much he enjoyed these foods. The richness of olive oil, the crunch of walnuts, the earthiness of beans. It was different from the heavy meals of his past, but it left him feeling lighter, more alive. "Food can heal as much as it can harm," Clara said one evening, and Matteo realized how true that was. Yet food was not the only change. Matteo began walking each morning, short distances at first, then a little further each week. He carried no tools, no burdens, only himself. He moved slowly, pausing when the dizziness came, but he kept going. The walks became more than exercise. They became a ritual of hope. Each step felt like resistance against the invisible blockages inside him, a quiet defiance against the weight of years. Sometimes he walked alone, listening to the sounds of the waking town. Other times, Clara walked beside him, her arm brushing his, a steady reminder that he was not fighting alone. One afternoon, Luca asked, "Nonno, why do you write so much in that notebook?" Matteo smiled, placing a hand on the boy's head. "Because my body tells me stories," he explained. "If I don't write them down, I forget what it's trying to say." Luca nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense. Matteo realized then that his notebook had become more than a record of symptoms. It was a dialogue with himself, a way of acknowledging what he once tried to hide. Each page was proof that he was learning, adapting, refusing to let silence claim him. Still, there were moments when the thought of blockages terrified him. Lying awake at night, he would imagine his arteries narrowing, blood struggling to pass. He would press a hand to his chest, listening to the thrum of his heart, wondering how long it could keep fighting. Clara, sensing his restlessness, would take his hand and whisper, "It's still beating. That's all that matters tonight." And Matteo would breathe easier, reminded that life was not lived in years or decades, but in nights like this, one heartbeat at a time. The blockages taught him humility. He no longer saw himself as invincible, no longer measured his worth by how much he could carry or how long he could work. Instead, he measured it in gentleness, how well he could listen to his body, how tenderly he could accept Clara's care, how openly he could admit his fears. This shift was not easy for a man who had built his life on strength. But Matteo began to see that real strength was not in denial. It was in surrendering to truth, in adapting, in choosing life even when it meant change. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Matteo sat with Clara on the balcony, sipping tea. "Do you think I can undo the blockages?" he asked quietly. Clara considered, then shook her head. "Maybe not undo, but you can slow them. You can live with them. You can make the days you have brighter, lighter." Matteo thought about this, then nodded. It wasn't the answer he wanted, but it was the truth he needed. He realized then that survival was not about erasing what had been done. It was about choosing differently now, about carving a new shape from the wood of his life. The truth about blockages was sobering, but it was also liberating. They reminded him of the cost of neglect, but they also showed him the power of small, steady changes. Matteo knew he could not rewrite the past, but he could still shape the present. And in that present, he chose Clara's cooking, morning walks, Luca's laughter, and the honesty of his notebook. He chose to see the blockages not as a sentence, but as a teacher, urging him to live with intention. That night, before bed, Matteo wrote one final note for the day. "Blockages are made slowly, but so is healing. Each choice matters. Tonight, I choose life." He closed the notebook, turned off the lamp, and lay beside Clara, listening to the steady beat of his heart. It was not perfect, not unburdened, but it was still his. And for now, that was enough. It was at the cafe that Matteo first overheard the conversation. Two men, younger than his own children, were sitting at the table beside him. One spoke with disbelief, his voice heavy with grief. 38 years old, he said, shaking his head. A heart attack out of nowhere. He went to the gym, worked hard, ate whatever he wanted. We all thought he was healthy. The other man only muttered, "Too young," before falling silent. Matteo sipped his coffee, the bitterness sharp on his tongue, his hand trembling slightly as he set the cup back down. He stared at the steam rising, thinking of his father who had died at 58, and now of this man, barely 38. The years between those numbers suddenly felt far too short. That evening, Matteo shared what he'd heard with Clara. They sat at the kitchen table, the lamp casting a warm circle of light over the wood. "They're younger and younger now," he said softly, his voice tinged with sorrow. "It isn't just us, Clara. It isn't just age." Clara nodded, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "Life is different now," she replied, "faster. People eat quickly, work too long, sit too much. They think they are strong until something breaks." Her words sank into Matteo's chest, heavy with truth. He thought of Luca, still a child, and of his own children, grown but still young in his eyes. The idea that heart attacks could strike people under 40 filled him with unease. Once, he had believed heart disease was a burden of old age, something you earned after decades of wear. But now he saw that it was not just about age, it was about choices, pressures, the invisible weight of modern living. He wondered if his years of late-night meals, cigarettes, and long hours had been no different from the way younger people now lived with fast food, endless screens, and constant stress. The next morning, Matteo went for his walk. The square was alive with younger faces, students carrying books, workers rushing to jobs, young mothers guiding strollers. He studied them quietly, wondering how many carried the same silent seeds inside their bodies that he did. He thought of the blockages forming quietly, the warning signs ignored, the way life lulled people into thinking they were safe until they weren't. The thought shook him, not just for himself, but for everyone he loved. Clara noticed his quietness when he returned. She set a bowl of oatmeal with fresh berries in front of him. "What weighs on you?" she asked. Matteo stirred the oatmeal slowly before answering. "They're dying too young, Clara, people who should still be full of life." He lifted his eyes to hers. "Ooh, I don't want Luca or our children to make the same mistakes I did. I don't want them to wait for warnings before they listen." Clara reached across the table, her hand steady on his. "Then show them," she said simply. "Live in a way that teaches them how to care for themselves." That afternoon, when Luca visited, Matteo spoke gently to him. He didn't talk about blockages or arteries. Those were words too heavy for a child. Instead, he said, "Luca, promise me something. Always eat slowly, always play outside, and always listen when your body whispers. It knows more than you think." Luca looked up, wide-eyed, and nodded solemnly, as though his grandfather's words were a sacred secret. Matteo smiled, relieved that even in simple terms, he could pass on what he had learned too late. Meals in their home became more deliberate. Clara introduced more fresh fruits, filling bowls with apples, pears, and grapes. She insisted they eat together at the table, never rushing, always savoring. Matteo began to see meals not as tasks, but as rituals, small acts of gratitude for the life still beating in him. He thought of the younger man at the cafe, whose meals may have been fast, careless, thoughtless. Now Matteo ate with intention, each bite a reminder that he was choosing to live. Still, the news of younger deaths haunted him. At church, he overheard another conversation about a woman in her early 40s who had collapsed while gardening. Each story was like a stone added to the pile he carried in his chest. He found himself writing in his notebook not just his own symptoms, but questions. Why so young? Is it stress? Food? Silence? He knew he couldn't answer them all, but writing them gave him a way to hold the grief without drowning in it. One evening, as the sun set and the streets quieted, Matteo spoke again to Clara. "It feels unfair," he said softly. "That life should be stolen so early from people who still had so much to see. But maybe," he paused, searching for words, "maybe their stories are warnings for us, reminders not to waste what time we're given." Clara nodded, her eyes glistening in the fading light. "Then we honor them," she said, "by living carefully, by not taking tomorrow for granted." The dizziness, the sweats, the numbness, Matteo no longer saw them as punishments. They were warnings, yes, but also gifts. They gave him time that so many younger souls had not been granted. Instead of despair, he began to feel gratitude for the chance to notice, to change, to keep going. He carried that gratitude into everything, into the way he chewed his food, the way he walked more slowly, the way he laughed with Luca even when he was tired. One night, he wrote in his notebook, "Younger people are dying too soon. I am still here. My duty is to live in a way that teaches, that remembers, that honors the warnings." He closed the book and sat with Clara on the balcony, the stars bright above them. He realized then that fear alone could not sustain him. What sustained him was love, for Clara, for Luca, for his family. Love was what turned fear into action, what made each day worth fighting for. The truth was harsh, heart attacks no longer waited for age, but Matteo had been given something precious, time to listen, time to adapt, time to live differently. And though the stories of the young haunted him, they also fueled him. He would not waste the chance he had been given. He would live each day as though it mattered, because it did. Matteo once believed that survival hinged on grand choices, life or death moments, heroic efforts. But as the months passed, he discovered the opposite was true. His heart wasn't saved by dramatic acts. It was steadied by small, ordinary habits, the kind most people overlook until it's too late. These daily rituals became the threads that wove his fragile health into something stronger, something more resilient. He began each morning with water, It was Clara's idea at first. She left a glass by his bedside so he would drink before standing. At first, Matteo resisted, muttering that water tasted of nothing. But he found that sipping slowly before rising eased the dizziness that sometimes greeted him. It was a small act, but it gave him confidence to start the day. Simple things matter, Clara reminded him, and Matteo realized she was right. Walking became another anchor. Not long marches across town, not the endless hours he once spent pacing the workshop, but gentle strolls at his own pace. He chose paths shaded by trees, benches nearby for resting. Clara often walked beside him, their steps aligned, their silence companionable. On mornings when Luca joined them, laughter filled the air, and Matteo's breath came easier. These short walks didn't erase his symptoms, but they gave him strength in a quiet, steady way. Each step was proof that his body still carried him, even if slower than before. Food, too, transformed from indulgence into medicine. Clara filled their table with color, bowls of spinach glistening with lemon, slices of apple and pear, roasted peppers drizzled with olive oil. Matteo discovered new appreciation for these simple meals. He began to savor textures and flavors instead of rushing. Each bite felt like a promise, a step away from the blockages that had threatened his life. He even learned to enjoy Clara's teas, mint in the afternoon, chamomile at night, rosemary on days when the dizziness lingered. They were small rituals, but they marked the rhythm of his days with gentleness. The notebook became his silent companion. At first, it was only a record of symptoms, sweats, numbness, dizziness, but slowly it grew into something more. Matteo began noting what eased the symptoms. Better after walking slowly, eased after tea, lighter dinner helped. He saw patterns emerge, lessons written in his own hand. One evening, Clara flipped through the pages and said softly, "This is more than a notebook. It's your story of survival." Matteo looked at the worn cover and realized she was right. It wasn't just paper, it was his dialogue with life, his way of refusing silence. Rest, too, became an act of courage. In his younger years, Matteo had scorned naps, calling them wasted time. But now he saw them differently. A short rest in the afternoon restored him more than stubbornness ever had. He would lie on the couch, the hum of Clara's sewing machine in the background, sunlight filtering through the curtains. Sometimes he dozed, sometimes he simply lay still, but always he rose with a bit more strength. Rest, he realized, was not weakness, it was wisdom, the body's way of repairing itself. Even laughter became medicine. He found himself smiling more easily, letting Clara's teasing and Luca's antics fill him with warmth. Once, while playing a simple card game with his grandson, Matteo laughed so hard tears came to his eyes. He felt the weight in his chest lift, if only for a moment. Later that night, he wrote in his notebook, "Laughter eases pain better than silence." It was true. Joy, even in small bursts, soothed him in ways no doctor's prescription could. One evening, sitting with Clara on the balcony, Matteo reflected aloud. "It's strange," he said, "how the things that save me are not the things I expected. Not the big efforts, not the grand gestures, just the water, the walks, the food, the rest." Clara smiled, her eyes soft in the fading light. "Maybe that's the point," she replied. "Life has always been in the small things. We just don't notice until they become our lifeline." Matteo reached for her hand, feeling the truth of her words. He thought of his father, who had never been given the chance to change habits, whose life had ended suddenly. Matteo felt grief, yes, but also gratitude. He had been given warnings, time, a chance to choose differently. And each small choice, each glass of water, each slow walk, each meal eaten with care, was his way of honoring that gift. The neighbors began to notice changes too. One remarked, "Matteo, you look lighter, calmer." He smiled, not boasting, only grateful. "I've learned to move slowly," he said simply. They didn't need to know the whole story. It was enough that his quiet changes were visible. Sometimes he even shared small tips. "A glass of water in the morning helps. Take a rest before you're exhausted." They were humble words, but they carried the weight of lived truth. By night, as he closed his notebook, Matteo often whispered to himself, "It's the little things." He thought of Clara's tea, Luca's laughter, the walks beneath the fig tree, the slow chewing of an apple slice. These habits didn't cure him, but they kept him here, kept him steady, kept him able to share life with the people he loved. And that, he realized, was more than enough. In the end, Matteo understood that survival was not about outrunning death. It was about tending life with care, weaving each day with habits that honored the heart. And as he lay beside Clara, listening to the quiet rhythm of her breathing, he promised himself that tomorrow he would drink the water, walk the walk, eat the simple meal, laugh with Luca, and rest without shame. Because in those small daily choices, he had found the true strength to keep living. The bells of the small church near Matteo's home rang out one Sunday morning, their echoes rolling gently through the narrow streets. Matteo stood at the window, watching people make their way inside, some rushing, some slow and steady like him. He felt a strange mix of peace and urgency. His life, he realized, had become a series of second chances, each one held together by the thin thread of awareness. Every time his body had whispered through dizziness, cold sweats, or numbness, it had been urging him to act. And every time he chose to listen, he stretched his time a little further. That morning, he didn't go inside the church. Instead, he walked slowly around the square, feeling the sun warm his shoulders. He paused by a fountain, listening to the water, breathing deeply. The rhythm of his heart was steady, but he never took it for granted anymore. He thought of how quickly things could change, how one ignored symptom, one dismissed warning could collapse into tragedy. He remembered the younger man at the cafe, gone too soon, and his father's early death. He thought of how many people believed they had time, only to discover that time had slipped away unnoticed. Clara joined him after the service, her scarf fluttering in the breeze. "You didn't come in," she said softly. Matteo shook his head. "My prayer is out here," he replied. "Every step I take, every breath, it's all a prayer now, a prayer to keep going." She smiled gently, understanding. For her too, each day was a gift. Each moment with Matteo, a reminder that nothing was guaranteed. Later, they sat at the kitchen table, sunlight streaming across the wood. Clara placed a small bowl of walnuts in front of him. "Eat," she said. "Good for your heart." Matteo chuckled, popping one into his mouth. "You've become my doctor," he teased. But in truth, he knew she was his lifeline. Her gentle nudges toward water, fruit, nuts, rest. They were small things, but they had saved him as surely as any prescription could. That evening, Matteo wrote in his notebook, "Every second is a choice." He thought about how often he had wasted seconds in the past, ignoring discomfort, working late into the night, eating without thought, dismissing Clara's concerns. Now he saw each second differently. A second could be the one in which he chose to drink water instead of wine, to walk instead of sit, to rest instead of push. A second could be the one where he decided to listen instead of deny. And those small seconds stacked together built the hours and days that still stretched before him. The urgency of it pressed on him most when he thought of Luca. One afternoon, they sat together on the balcony, the boy swinging his legs, chattering about school. Matteo watched him, memorizing the energy in his face, the sparkle in his eyes. "Nonno," Luca asked suddenly, "why do you always write in that book?" Matteo paused, then placed the notebook in his grandson's hands. "Because every second matters, Luca," he said, "and when you write them down, you don't forget. You learn to see how precious they are." Luca flipped through the pages, eyes wide at the notes, the dates, the careful handwriting. "Will you give this to me one day?" he asked. Matteo's throat tightened, but he nodded. "One day, yes. And I hope when you read it, you'll remember to act when your body speaks to you." The lesson wasn't just for Luca. Matteo found himself speaking more often with friends, neighbors, even strangers. At the cafe, he would quietly mention his morning water routine to the man beside him. In the square, he advised a younger worker to take breaks, to listen when exhaustion set in. These weren't grand speeches, just gentle suggestions woven into conversation. He never wanted to lecture. He only wanted to plant seeds of awareness that might one day keep someone alive. Still, Matteo knew not everyone would listen. Some laughed off his advice, just as he once had. But he didn't let it discourage him. He remembered the urgency of his symptoms, the near misses, the warnings. He carried them like sacred knowledge, reminders that time was fragile. If even one person acted sooner because of his words, it was worth it. One evening, as dusk settled, Matteo and Clara sat side by side, watching the lights flicker on across the town. The quiet wrapped around them, and Matteo turned to her. "You know," he said, "I used to believe that strength was about enduring, about pushing past pain. Now I know it's about acting quickly, It's about hearing the whispers before they become screams. Clara squeezed his hand, her eyes reflecting the glow of the street lamps. "And you did," she whispered. "You listened. That's why we still have this moment." The next day, Matteo returned to the doctor for a checkup. The waiting room was filled with faces, some young, some old, all carrying invisible fears. When his name was called, he stepped inside with steady resolve. The doctor smiled as he reviewed the notes. "You've made changes," he said approvingly. "It shows." Matteo nodded. "It's not about big changes," he replied softly. "It's about acting in the moment, about not wasting time." The doctor agreed, but Matteo didn't need his validation. He had already learned that truth through lived experience. As he left the clinic, Matteo felt the weight of urgency lift slightly. He couldn't stop time. He couldn't undo the years of strain his body had endured, but he could honor the seconds he had left. He could choose again and again to act now, to respond, to live with intention. That night, he wrote one final note in bold letters. "Every second counts. Don't wait. Act." He underlined it twice, then closed the notebook with care. Clara came to his side, resting her head on his shoulder. Together, they watched the stars scatter across the sky, each one a reminder of the infinite moments they still hoped to share. Matteo no longer feared the future in the same way. Fear had softened into awareness, and awareness had become gratitude. He knew his heart was fragile, but it was also strong, stronger for every choice, every habit, every second he had claimed. And as long as he remembered that truth, he would keep living fully, urgently, with love guiding each breath. Because in the end, it wasn't about outlasting death. It was about honoring life, one second at a time. When we first met Matteo, he was a man caught between denial and fear, unsure whether the warning signs in his body were whispers or storms. Dizziness, cold sweats, moments of numbness, he wanted to ignore them, as many of us do. But those fragile seconds became his turning points. They pushed him to listen, to change, and to choose life one decision at a time. Along the way, he learned that healing doesn't come from grand gestures. It's not about waiting for the perfect treatment or some miracle cure. It's about the water he drank each morning before rising, the quiet walks beneath the trees, the light meals Clara lovingly prepared, the notebook where he recorded both fear and progress, and the laughter, always the laughter, that kept his heart strong in ways medicine never could. Matteo's journey reminds us that transformation is possible at any age, that small daily choices stacked together can protect the moments that matter most. Sitting with a grandchild, walking hand in hand with a partner, breathing peacefully at the end of the day. So if you've been waiting, if you've been telling yourself that tomorrow you'll rest more, tomorrow you'll drink more water, tomorrow you'll finally listen to your body, don't wait. Tomorrow is never promised. The whispers of your body are not enemies. They are warnings, invitations to act. Matteo chose to listen, and in doing so, he claimed more days, more love, more life. You can too, because every second counts. Every small choice is a chance to stay, to breathe, to love a little longer. The story is Matteo's, but the choice, dear friend, is yours. Act now.